remarried in 1942. And when Gran Rice died at the age of 11, I had to go and live with my parents then, and my family, who were sitting here in green. And I was very fortunate. I had the most wonderful stepmother that anyone could have had. So the rest of the time I grew up in Montacute, which explains why there are lots of drawings of Montacute and Montacute hats and so on. Now, I went to Yeovil Grammar School. I wasn't terribly happy there. I always kind of felt I was a bit of a dunce, because I would come 23rd, 25th in the class, and it wasn't till years later that I realised I was in the A stream and there were 2 more streams below me. But there were so many bright kids in that class, you know, they were all destined for Oxford and Cambridge, so I just didn't feel comfortable with it. And the art classes were a bit of a respite. I can remember drawing from the age of about 8 years old. And one of the things, you know how you had radios that were about this big in the 40s and so on? And we had a table with those, what's it called, candy twist legs. And I remember sitting there thinking, how the hell do I draw that, you know? And I must have been about 8, and so I'd always kind of drawn. And when I was at school, at grammar school, I got good marks for chemistry because I could draw the diagrams. I got good marks for physics. You know, it was all about my drawing rather than my academic qualities. And the art classes were not very good. There was a lady who, you know, was very uninspiring, but I did, as I say, it was a respite really. And when I got to the age, I took O levels, and I got 4 O levels, including art, and I left school then. There didn't seem much point in going on for A levels, and my dad said, you know, well, everyone said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I don't really hear anything. I mean, I really like doing is drawing. And my father, bear in mind that my father left school at 14, and he was a farm labourer until he was 20, before he could get an apprenticeship to be a glove cutter, which of course what everyone around Yeovil became, is a glove cutter. And there was a glove factory in Montacute, there was a glove factory in Tintinhull, all over. So, you know, he thought the boy can go and get a job. And he suggested I went to get a drawing office, try and get a job in the drawing office in Westminster. And as it happened, my mother's sister, Aunt Lena, who'd always taken an interest in me, and she didn't have any children of her own. She was married and ran a pub in Lyme, Regis. And I used to spend my summer holidays from the age of about 8, 9, 10, you know, that kind of age. It was wonderful. I'd spend 3 or 4 weeks with her every summer. And she would appear every now and again and after school and take me to the Cadena Cafe, the long gone Cadena Cafe across the borough there. Or I remember she took me to the Festival of Britain and to another trip to London to see the Tower of London. So she would, you know, and she came along and said, oh, you could be an architect. And I thought,
just like that.
Yeah. But you know, I just had this interest in old buildings, and I didn't really understand what it meant to be an architect. So she marched me along to Yeovil School of Art and said, my nephew wants to be an artist, an architect. And they said, well, he's not old enough to go to architectural college, and he would need 2 A levels anyway. So if he came here for a year, we could sort of devise a course for him. I mean, they were desperate to get students, obviously. And he could take the 2 A levels. Well, that's in fact what I did. And so I spent the first year studying history of architecture, and that's why there's little drawings of Salisbury Cathedral and excuse me, things like that there, and lots of Montacute House, of course. I just, oh yes, I was introduced to an architect who'd been at Yeovil Grammar School, lived in Yeovil, and he gave me this book on, sort of how to become an architect, and I read it and I thought, no, that's not what I want to do. For one thing, my maths was not very good. So I asked if I could swap on to the ordinary art course, which was a 4-year course, and for 2 years you did a sort of foundation course. It was called the intermediate exam in arts and crafts in those days. And then the next 2 years you studied for the national diploma. So that's what I did, but they wouldn't let me take painting because I hadn't had any experience of colour. So they said, well, you'll have to do illustration, which is graphic design in today's terms. But it had a subsidiary subject, and I opted for textile printing. And that was rather, yeah, I will have a sip, if you don't mind.
Just one. You also got many times you noticed that they were all having much more fun.
Yeah, it all seemed much more fun, the whole art school thing. But I have to say, well, the other thing that I admitted to say was in my last year at Yeovil Grammar School, a friend of mine from Ash said to me, there's an after-school class at the art school. Do you fancy going to it? So I said, yeah, and it was a bit of a sacrifice because it meant you missed the school bus home, but in those days there were buses. You only had to go and stand on the bus stop. You didn't need to look at the timetable. A bus would come along every half an hour. So it wasn't too bad, but I loved it from immediately I got in there, and we were only in, there for an hour, but it meant I had some kind of knowledge of what the art school was like. Anyway, I swapped onto the foundation course, and the textile printing was rather fortunate, really, because the course was quite academic, and there was a lot of drawing from figures and from the nude and still life and all that kind of thing. But of course with textiles you had a certain amount of freedom. You could make abstract shapes and so on. And I got through my first foundation course, got onto the national diploma course, and again, it was very disciplined. I can't emphasize this too much. It was about teaching skills. There was absolutely no concept that you would become a practicing artist. It just, to be an artist, you had to be rich, or you had to be in a family of artists, like the John family, Augustus John, all those sort of people. And it just wasn't a concept that existed. You were going to be a teacher, and so you were taught skills in order to pass them on to the next generation. The other thing was that the art school started at 9 in the morning and finished at 9 at night. You were there for 12 hours. There was a tea break, there was a lunch break, an hour, I guess, and a tea break for about an hour and a half. But you had a set evening class, which you were expected to attend. And so then you had things like lectures in art history, history of costume we did, and something that influenced me greatly was heraldry. There was a lady called Elsie K. Kohler from Cheltenham Ladies College, and you know, she was a big lady, and she taught heraldry, and you know, you just learnt so much in those evening classes. And sometimes there'd be a model as well for drawing. People did come in from outside, you know, part-time people came in. But when I started, there were 8 full-time students. That was the biggest year they'd ever had. And there were 20 full-time students in total. And we had 3 full-time members of staff and 3 or 4 part-time members of staff. So the staff-student ratio was like 2 to 1. The mind boggles, really. But it was a happy place, you know, we just had a great time.
And you were the first generation for whom it was free.
Yes, well, virtually anyway, yeah. And that was important because suddenly you had all these working class kids who were able to, you know, there were 2 education acts in the 40s and 50s, and one was free secondary education for all, and then free further education for all. And that opened up the door for this, you know, generations of working class kids. And I was very fortunate to be around at that time. And, you know, the big event was the Christmas ball at the art school, where everything was cleared. And it was quite big studios, sort of L-shaped studios. I've been trying to find photos of the art school, and there's lots of pictures of old Yeovil. There's a picture of the entrance I found in various books to the art school, because it was an art and technical college, and the technical college was joined, and you sort of went through this alleyway to the art school. By the way, my connection with Yeovil now doesn't exist anymore. The house I was born in has been demolished down in Vincent Road. The house my parents bought was demolished when they built Queensway. My grammar school's been demolished, and the art school's been demolished. I'm surprised that John's Church is still I don't know what it is about you, but they just obsess with knocking things down. Anyway, so I don't really have a connection with Yeovil anymore, because it's all gone. But anyway, the Christmas ball, the senior student, someone would go down to the Western Gazette and get these big rolls of newsprint, and we'd cover all the walls with newsprint, and the senior students would do all the drawing, you know, and then us little second years and third years, we'd colour it all in, and there'd be a theme every year, and you know, there was a cowboy theme one year, and a kind of jungle theme, I remember. And there was one about.
You've got some photos.
Well, there are 1 or 2 photos in the thing, but the Western Gazette used to come along and get everyone into a heap, you know, and just do this big photograph of sort of everyone at the ball. And there was a trad jazz band called the Yeovil Valley Jazz Band who played every year, and you just danced. But it was the preparation and doing the fancy dress, you know. I remember the painting tutor who was Robert Ellis, and he'd just left the Royal College of Art and come to Yeovil. And he was teaching us all how to make holsters out of cardboard and Stetsons out of papier-mâché. You know, I mean, you kind of learned a lot in doing that, and also painting, even though you were colouring in these big wall paintings. You know, it was just such a great thing to do. I was very shy at that stage, and still am really. So I always made a costume that covered me up. And so if I'm in the photograph, you won't see me because I've got a mask on or something. There's one where I'm a witch doctor with this thing over my head. That's me in the bottom right-hand corner. But it was such, it was a privilege really to be around at that time and to have that experience and to learn the skills that stay with you for the rest of your life. And I was very lucky to.
So what drew you to London then?
Yes.
That?
Well, after art school, I had to do national service, so I did two years in the army. I had quite a good cycling career in the Yeovil Cycling Club, and so I spent the 2 years national service touring around Britain, cycling, racing for the army. And came out, and I had secured a place at Goldsmith Collage to do teacher training, because that's what, let's say, everyone did. And Goldsmiths was a great experience because, well, the other thing which, I've described the good side of being an art student in the 50s, but the downside was that you never actually saw any real art. We had a trip to London once a year, to look at galleries. And the library was a cupboard about the big of that, this big with 30, 40 books. But none of them, colour reproduction was very expensive in those days. So most of, even all the art magazines were in black and white. So you didn't get, and so when I was at Goldsmiths, I got to, go around Court Street and go to the galleries at last. And also go to some concerts and things. The other thing I forgot to mention about the art school was that we'd have outings with a little bus, and we went to Montacute House, of course. And one of the outings was to Porlock Weir, because our life model, who's the lady in that postcard that we did, that drawing of her, she had a place at Porlock Weir. So we would go off on these day trips, sketching, because, we were supposed to take your sketchbook and draw. And the other thing, that they would have a sketch camp every summer. And one of the years they went to Porlock Weir, and I couldn't do it for reasons, but we went to Polruan in Cornwall. You'll see the odd drawing of Polruan there. Where else did we go? I think there was one at the beginning. We went to West Bay, but that was before. Anyway, that was another great adventure, really, and a good experience. Anyway, I ended up in the Goldsmiths. Great crowd of people, top quality teachers, and because I'd been in the army for 2 years, I was like blotting paper. I just soaked up everything that was available, and you had a day and a half a week. You were sent out to schools as a trainee teacher. The other half day you had lectures on teaching, education, and then you had 3 days a week to do your own thing, to prepare your final exhibition at the end of the year. And we had a brilliant lithographer. We had Paul Drury doing relief printing. He was a great friend of Graham Sutherland's. And Gordon Baldwin teaching ceramics. It was extraordinary, really. And so I did textile printing, I did ceramics, I did typography, lithography, and relief printing, a little bit of painting. All again with the supposition that you would learn these skills to pass on to school children. and also been in London for a year, you know, went to concerts at the Festival Hall and all sorts of things.
And you were at the back door of the Royal College all the time.
Yes, well, my best friend Derek Boshier, who was a year behind me at Yeovil School of Art, had got into the Royal College. And he was in the same year as David Hockney, Alan Jones, Peter Phillips, Pauline Boaty, you know, that year. And so we would come up, a little contingent from Goldsmith would come up to the Royal College every Friday night because they had these great dances. What was the band called? The Temperance Seven. It was the Royal College band, you know. So that was, you know, it was a great experience. Anyway, you had, in order to get your, I passed my sort of exams at Goldsmiths, just. I was sent to a very rough school in East London for my day's teaching, and I had no help. You know, you were supposed to prepare lessons and all that, and I walked in the door on the first day, and this harassed little lady said, "Are you the student?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Right, you're in 4B down there," and disappeared and left me with 4B, you know, and they didn't want to be there anyway doing art lessons. But you learned to cope. The other half day was brilliant because I was in the Victoria and Albert Museum with some little public school kids, you know, this big, and we had a great time there, except I had to keep them in one gallery, otherwise I'd never lose them and never see them again. And then so you had to take a year teaching, and I took a job in Hatter's Lane Secondary School at High Wycombe, and it was a boys' secondary school, and it was all right, it wasn't a bad school, and I did my year there, but by Christmas I decided this is not for me, whatever, you know, I had sort of made up my mind really that I really wanted to try and have a go, be an artist, make a living as an artist. But I also was having quite a bit of success in racing, cycle racing. I got fed up with getting the train from London. I was sharing a flat with Derek Boshier in London, from London to High Wycombe every day. And I thought, I could cycle it in the time. So I started cycling from London to High Wycombe and back every day, which I think it's 45 miles. So I was doing like 90 miles a day. And I got very fit. So I gave up the teaching job, and I thought, I'm going to go to France and see if I can make a living racing. So I set off in 1961, was that, I think. And after 2 races in France, I decided that I couldn't make a living. Mainly because my forte was stamina and long distance racing. And in France, every time you have a village fete, you have a cycle race, and you just go around the village, you know, a kilometre, round and round and round, and every 4 or 5 laps there's a sprint for a prize, you know, 50 francs or something. And I met another English guy there in the first race I entered, and he said, you know, I'm making a living just. And as soon as this race started, he just shot away and lapped the whole field. So every time they came round for a sprint, he won it because he was a lap ahead. But then after about 30 laps, they knocked him off his bike. You know. And so I went down to the south of France, and I rode in another race there, which started at 8 o'clock at night. So it was pitch dark, and it was in Set, which was lots of canals and things, and you were going round and nearly sort of getting shoved off into the canal every time you went round a bend. And you know, I mean, I could finish with them, but I wasn't going to win anything. So I upped and went off to Spain. I thought, well, give it a whirl in Spain. Maybe there's some mountains there I can climb. And to cut a long story short, I finished up. Derek Boshier by then had said, we're going to be, he and another guy, we're going to take this place in Fuengirola, which was a fishing village then. And he said, if you feel like coming down to Spain, you know, why don't you come and look us up? So I did. I got the train. I didn't cycle all the way down. Put my bike on the train and went down to Fuengirola and met up with Derek and this friend, Peter Jones. And they said, oh, we're going to Morocco tomorrow. So why don't you come with us? So I thought, why not? So I managed to park my bike in Gibraltar in the Toc H. I mean, someone told me that's where, you know, it was English people, you could be sure the bike would be all right. And we hitchhiked down to the Sahara Desert, just as far as you could go in Spain. And if a car came on, or a van or a lorry, they would almost certainly give you a lift, but only one every hour or two would come along. So we'd sit there drawing, and you know, we only had like pencils and maybe pen and ink and getting the dust, you know, to sort of colour it from a bit and so on. But I was doing this, and it was like I suddenly thought, this is what I want to do. You know, I want to be an artist, and I want to be able to draw and paint. And it was like, finally, I made up my mind. This moment, sitting there in the desert, sometimes hours on end. And so I did, and we went down to the south of Spain, to south of Morocco, literally as far as you could go. You know, there was this place called Goulamine, and there are 5 villages called the Ports of the Sahara, and all the blue men they were coming across the Sahara there. It was a fantastic experience. Anyway, came back.
And if I can interrupt, brought those drawings back.
Oh yes.
Which, how many years later, in 2014, at the Red Fan Gallery in
They were selling them for 1,200 quid each.
That was quite a rate of demand.
Yeah. We didn't even have paper. We had to get wrapping paper. You know, sort of. Anyway, it's lovely. And I cycled home from Gibraltar. I cycled home to Montacute, and it took me, I don't know, a week or something like that. I remember I stopped off in Paris because I had to get the boat train from Paris for some reason, and I thought, I might as well go around the Louvre whilst I'm in Paris, but the only shoes I had were these cycling shoes, which have little metal plates on the bottom. So when you're walking or hard, it goes click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, and it was embarrassing. You know, everyone was looking at me. So the next day, I did have a pair of, what are those? Espadrilles as well, which I bought, you know. So I thought, I know, I'll put those on. So I went back to Louvre the next day, but it peed with rain. So then I was walking, every time I walked, this time it went swish. Anyway, I love the Louvre, there was some nice things.
And you could see the Mona Lisa in those days.
Yes, it wasn't.
So there's nobody in front of it.
I cycled back to Montacute, and you know, the amazing experience was I got off the boat train at Southampton, and I was cycling through the New Forest, and suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this bright red thing on the ground there. And I put my brakes on and I stopped, and it was a leaf off a bramble bush that had turned red. You know how they do? Mm-hmm. And that was the first colour I'd seen for months, because, you know, it was all brown and burnt and right up through France as well. And I plucked it and put it in my diary and kept it. I may still have it in a book somewhere. And suddenly I was back in England, you know, and everything was green and colourful. And so I went back to my parents' house in Montacute, and Ray and Nettie will remember, our father had got into having battery hens, so they built this shed, he and an uncle, and they did it for some years, but it became like kind of not the thing to do really, you know, to keep chicken in cages. So he got rid of them and there was this empty shed. That was my studio. So I did what I still call the chicken shed paintings. And I produced about a dozen, 12 or 15 paintings in a year. They were all quite big. They were 6 foot by 4 foot. And I didn't have very much money at all. I supported myself by doing gardening 2 or 3 days, you know, just odd job gardening. And I made, mostly I used decorator's paint on these paintings, which is quite shiny, so I mixed sand with it. And I got this collection of paintings together, and I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a booklet here that Derek Boshier got us all to describe about our time at Yeovil School of Art. And he, when he was at the Royal College, because we'd all come from around Yeovil, and nearly everyone was a teacher, they'd all come back home to Yeovil during the summer holidays. So we started a little group of artists, called ourselves Yeovil Artists. And we would have an exhibition in the St John's Church Hall, just over here, Church Lane. And we did that for 4 years or so. And Alex, who's sitting at the back there shyly, his father was one of them, Don Murley. He was a year or two ahead of me at art school. And there were about 8 of us, and we showed there every year. And then one year, a lady came down from Bath, because she wrote for the Bath Chronicle, and she came to review the show. And she picked me and one other chap called John Bonan and asked us if we'd like to have a show in their gallery. And they had she and her husband had a gallery in Bath called the Finburris Gallery. And that was my first solo show.
But one of those chicken shed paintings is the Museum of Somerset now, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Yes, they've gone into, a few of them have gone into collections.
One in extra.
Yeah. Well, the museum, one that the Museum of Somerset have, I sold twice, somehow. And it ended up with a dealer in St Ives who died, and it went into auction, and they bought it. Some Museum of Somerset bought it last year or the year before, and I said, it's going to be £5,000. I didn't know how much money they bought it for 5,500, which is quite a bargain, really. And it was called The End of a Cyclist's Dream. And I got to the point where I had to decide if I was going to be a racing cyclist or an artist. And really there was no choice. I mean, I was quite good on a club level. You know, I held records around Yeovil Club, and I was club champion 3 times, but I could see that to get anywhere and make a living as a, you know, I had to be either train a lot more or get a lot better. So that was the last painting, you know, that was the painting I did after I decided to give up cycle racing, which was tough, and I still miss it to this day. And I love cycling and cycle racing, but watch it on the telly now. So
back to London and then back to Dorset.
yes, after that year I went back to London, and I stayed with Derek Boshier for a few weeks until I found myself a bedsit. And that week when I was staying with Derek was when Ken Russell came to film him in Pop Goes the Easel. And I was banished into the kitchen whilst they filmed this bit, and banished somewhere else where they filmed him in the kitchen. And then there was that fantastic party. I'm sure you've all, you know, most of you have seen Pop Goes the Easel by now. twist party that they show on television every time, and there's me standing in the corner and trying to look in, because we were told to keep out of the way, you know, and Derek and Pauline Boaty, and I remember trying to teach Peter Blake how to do the twist. And you know, he's so roly-poly, you know, Peter, and I was saying, no Peter, you do it. So London was just a fantastic place to be in the 60s, and it was so open, you know, there were so many opportunities. And I was very quickly, I had a girlfriend from Somerset, and her landlord was quite a collector of art, and he introduced me to a gallery called the New Vision Centre, a man named Dennis Bowen. And it was the most, I didn't know at the time, the most avant-garde gallery in London. And they, you know, they were an abstract painters gallery, and they had people from all over Europe, from the colonies, you know, just, I mean, they're Jamaican artists and people still I read about, and I think, oh, I remember him showing at the New Vision Centre, you know. This Dennis Bowen and his partner, a guy called Kenneth Smith, they were just kind of open, you know, just so. Anyway, I had 2 shows with them, and then the gallery closed down. It had been going 10 years. It never made any money. I mean, they showed Lucio Fontana, you know, the guy with just slashing canvases. Everyone thought they were insane. They fetched thousands now, you know. But, you know, it just happens, these things. And just as the New Vision Centre closed, this American guy came along, and he was called Eugene Schuster, and he was studying for a master's in history of art or something at Oxford University, and he started buying prints from British printmakers and taking them back in the holidays and selling them to finance himself. And you know, he could make good money selling them in America. And somehow he had someone working for him, and they came to me and bought some prints and sold them, and came back and bought some more, and came back and bought some more. And the other thing was that prints were very, very popular at that time. You know, they were cheap, relatively cheap, and that people had prints on them. And eventually, they were called London Graphic Arts, he called himself, not Schuster, and he put me under contract, and he paid me £100 a month, which doesn't sound much today, but in the 1960s, I mean, I was earning £15 a day teaching in art school. So, you know, it was that and the art school teaching. I'll come on to that in a minute. So I got a contract each year to do so many designs. I didn't have to print them or anything, you know, just designs for screen prints. And they were professionally printed in quite large editions, taken over to the USA. And he had a team of travelling salesmen with estate cards, and they were all in cellophane. You know, they weren't framed, they were in cellophane sleeve. And he would go all around the universities and colleges, setting up whistle-stop shows and selling prints like crazy.
But visually, Brian, I think it's a good moment to fill in from how you moved from this to this. I mean, you know, we're actually in the 60s and these were all a lot later, but,
Yeah.
but that move into abstract.
Well, he blamed the American abstract expressionists, of course, you know. I mean, it was those shows that came to England, to the Tate Gallery. There were actually 2. And they changed art schools overnight. You know, everyone threw away their canvases and started getting the biggest sheet of hardboard you could buy and splashing painting on it. And I was, as I had left art school, but I was as affected by that as anyone. But the other thing, to go back a bit, was doing textile printing and the freedom of doing abstract designs for textiles, which, you know, it's great to be learning to draw and drawing landscape and so on. But I also had this hankering always for the abstract. And, anyway, so I lost my place now.
I know, but I just felt
Yeah,
that
no,
the
you're
background is
absolutely
really
right.
important, but that shift to London
Yeah,
also visually, London in the 60s had,
Well, the other things that
Was
happened
fashion.
were Bauhaus exhibitions.
and the Bauhaus.
And, you know, I'd never heard of the Bauhaus until the 60s. And there were, I think, again, 2 major shows in London. And I was just so taken by the whole idea of that not just the paintings were arts, but the textiles, you know, everything was designed and sort of geometrically worked out. And that really got to me. And I started, when I got to London, 1962, I set about, the first paintings I did were based on heraldry, this inherent thing, back to Elsie Kohler, you know, the heraldic shapes. And the other thing about London was I was really taken with things like the tube sign, this big, you know, relish, which, you know, of course was a Bauhaus inspired thing. And road signs, excuse me, all those kind of things. So I started making these, and then I moved into my first proper flat, which was along Cromwell Road, and it was almost opposite the Natural History Museum, and very close to the V&A. And of course, the painting school at the Royal College then was behind the V&A, and they used to get luncheon tickets to have their lunch in the V&A. It was a canteen in those days, it wasn't a posh restaurant. So I used to go over there, you'd get a cheap lunch. So I got to know all the students at the Royal College, plus the fact that Derek was there, and I'd go in and see him. He worked in the next studio space to David Hockney. And, you know, I've met people recently who say, I remember when you were at the Royal College. And I said, well, I wasn't. I was only there for lunch. I kind of, you know, a certain amount of family pressure, but, you know, I felt that I'd had enough of being a student. I wanted to get on with earning a living. And I was earning a living. Something other very fortunate happened was someone I was at Goldsmiths with, a lady called Jennifer Dixon. She became head of printmaking at Brighton. And she rang me up one day, don't know how she found my number, 1965, 66 I think it was, and said, would you like to come to Brighton and teach screen printing? Because she'd seen my screen prints, you know, and so I said, yeah, and it was only a day a week to begin with, but it developed into 2 days a week. And I stayed teaching at Brighton for 32 years, but only ever 2 days a week. And I taught in lots of other art schools, for, you know, I mean, one year there were cutbacks and I was cut back to 1 day, and so I taught at Croydon College of Art for a year. And then there must have been another cut sometime, and I taught at Hornsey for a year. But I was visiting lecture, you know, all over the place, the Slade, the Royal College, and they just asked you to come in once a term and do a day. Because that's what art colleges relied on, you know, professional artists going in and doing the odd day. You know, I mean, I remember people like John Hoyland and all sorts of people coming down to Brighton when I was there.
You've got about 10 minutes to do the next 50 years.
Well, then I died. Yeah. So, yes, I mean, I can't go on about the 60s and how great it was to be in London in the 60s. I met all sorts of famous people. I met 3 of the Beatles. I did have a girlfriend briefly who I think had an affair with John Lennon, and she kept saying, well, why don't we go down and have a swim in John's pool down at Weybridge or wherever it was. And I didn't even have a swimming costume there, and I thought, I don't want to go down there, but she only wants to see John Lennon, you know. So I never did meet John Lennon, but I met the others, and I became great friends with a guy called Ian Stewart, who was a founder member of the Rolling Stones with Brian Jones. But when he got chucked out when Andrew Oldham signed them up, and he said, get rid of the ugly one. And I thought, how did they make out Stu was the ugly one? He was a piano player anyway, but they kept him on, because he stayed on as their road manager, played on most of the albums. If you look carefully, it says Ian Stewart. And in the end, organised all their tours and everything, designed their recording studio. But he came down to West Bay a lot, and we became great mates, and he would come round. And I had a little party one Christmas, and he came, and he had a guitar in each hand, and he said, have you got somewhere safe I can put these? He said, this is Mick's and this is Keith's. If it gets stolen, they'll murder me. So I met their guitars. I did meet them, but you didn't talk to them. They were pop royalty, you know.